Farmers today are facing rising costs, volatile markets, and extreme weather. The A Better Way to Farm podcast digs into strategies to help you take control of farm inputs and maximize profit so your farm can thrive for generations. Remember to take advantage of our free resources at abetterwaytofarm.com. Now, from America's Heartland, here's your host. Welcome back to the A Better Way to Farm podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, National Field Agronomist for the team. Did you know that we spend each and every day providing solutions for our farmers to grow better crops and to make more money? I want to invite you onto this podcast today and share some stories, share some insight into a question, especially this time of year that we get asked a lot. It is the season for spreading cover crops. You know, as we look across the United States, everyone down south is done with harvest, wrapping things up, getting close to finished, working on their second crop as we look through the Midwest. And again, we're getting things started, we're getting things rolling. And we always get this time of year questions on cover crops. We brought in a gentleman from Southeast Iowa, an expert in the field of cover crops, somebody that is extremely passionate about cover crops. He's been in the industry for over 4 years. He's still very young. He's going to school at William Penn University, kind of in West Iowa, where he lives. They have a small family farm, mostly of livestock, and that's where he really built his love and his passion, not only for agriculture, but also for cover crops and the true value that cover crops bring to you as a grower. If you would, why don't you help me welcome to our show my good friend, Mr. Ryan Wolf. Ryan, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm good. How are you doing? Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you would, why don't you go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and kind of tell the listener that's on here today a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm from Southeast Iowa, Van Buren County. I live pretty close to Rod and Kayla. Went to high school with Kayla. She was my class. Really getting started in agriculture. I got a job my first year of college working in a seed business in Keosauqua, my hometown. And so since then, I've been at work there for 4 years. Since then, I've just been really into the ag industry, and I know I want to stay in it. So started the business and love to farm. So that this whole ag thing is kind of my life. I think you know some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Ryan, that's one of the things that we talked a little bit kind of off air. And everybody that listens to this podcast already knows my story because I tell my story all the time, but because I can and nobody tells me to stop. So, you know, when you grow up, there's just this, to me, there's this passion and this drive and this love for agriculture. I didn't know anything else, and I didn't know there was anything else that you could do. And I'm kind of assuming that that's kind of what the path that you went down as well. When did you know that growing up you were going to be in agriculture?
Pretty well from a young age. I was always around it. I love combines. Grew up loving combines, all toy combines all the time. So I knew I loved it pretty well. First year of college, I worked for a bank for a little while. That was all right. And then I got this job selling seed and stuff. My brother kind of got me the job, and ever since then, helping farmers, meeting the customer group in the area. I've just known from then, I mean, this is it. This is what I want to do. So it's been a real easy decision since then. It's just, like you said, it's just kind of in your blood.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about what you are doing, and when I went through, after I graduated college and stuff, and I kind of started getting my feet wet in the ag industry, I worked at a couple co-ops, and then I became a DSM for a couple different seed companies before I joined A Better Way to Farm. And, now this is all I do. You, however, went kind of down, instead of doing the standard, corn, soybeans, and other stuff, you went down the cover crop route, and you got some experience. I guess we really didn't talk about the age, but I know that obviously you're still in school at William Penn. So I don't think you're my age, but you started kind of dabbling in cover crops, about 4 years ago or so. What was it about cover crops specifically that you said, you know what, instead of going down hybrid seed corn or soybeans, what was it about the cover crops that made you go that direction?
So grew up on a farm, and And we have a cattle operation. So I always kind of lean towards the cattle more than the row crop. I still love combines and seeing corn and stuff, but started working for the seed business, and the soil, I would say, soil health, that kind of drew me into the cover crops more so than anything. I started doing a lot of research about some of the effects of, synthetic fertilizer on soil, and kind of seeing that, maybe this corn soybean thing isn't the best option for soil health. Maybe these cover crops and cattle is a better option. So really the big thing for me was we've got this little plot right next to the store there where we sell seed, and we grow sweet corn there. And we've now cover cropped it for 4 years, very intense management, and just seeing how quickly that soil has changed, in the cover crop world and the soil health world, you want black cottage cheese or black cake. And so seeing how that soil has turned to that black cottage cheese so quickly from our intense management, it's been such an eye-opening thing. And man, this is fun. And the further I dive into the soil health thing, I just kind of see, wow, this is interesting. The deeper you go, all the biology, and something cool that I think about a lot is in a handful of soil, there is more life in that handful of healthy soil than there is on planet Earth, humans on planet Earth. I think that's just so fascinating how easy it is to overlook it. But below ground, that's your most important livestock is that micro population.
Yeah, one of the words that I'm going to pluck out of what you just said is overlook. And I that's why I'm excited about you being on this episode today, is that I really think cover crops are getting underutilized and overlooked as a source. To me, it's about nutrition and plant health. And I love that you said that, because so many of our clients, so many of the people that I talk to, they're doing cover crops for, and I hate to say it because I don't want to drum this side of it up, but they're doing it for carbon credits or money because the NRCS or somebody's paying them to do it. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. We have I know some people have some fancy terminology for some products that they'll apply to their fields in the fall to kind of break down or melt down stalks and residue and stuff. And I've been telling growers, I've been very fortunate enough to work with growers and do these 2-day fundamentals of agronomy events. You happen to go to one that we just had a couple months ago. And to me, I always say a couple different things. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could get to the point where we're not using any synthetic fertilizer at all? And that's coming from a guy that sells fertilizer for a living. But, I absolutely believe that. And the other side of that is I absolutely think that there are things that we are over applying greatly: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other things that we are not applying, probably under applying. But if we can work with our soil that we've, been given, maybe had the opportunity to buy, and do, put some cover crops on there and do the system the right way, I think it would be amazing. I think people would be amazed at how well that system is in place. So to get back to, instead of me rambling, because this is not about me, it's about you, I have a lot of things to say on cover crops. So I'm glad that I got to do this interview. Now that you've got some experience and you're going to school, you're getting ready to go out of school, so you're going to be doing this hardcore full time. Now, as a business owner, where do you see your largest gain, your biggest benefit, the growers that you're working with, the clients that you're bringing in? Where are you seeing some of their biggest successes come from?
Biggest successes, really, to see them start to notice the changes in soil health has been the biggest success. The first off, starting with just erosion right on the baseline, that's really easy to see. Erosion, wind erosion, water erosion. That's been the easiest to see. Family I work for up here, great family, they've got into cover crops more to help to prevent erosion. Cover crops are great at that. That has been a benefit. I over the weekend, I went to a guy's farm. We looked at some of his crops, and he's completely dove headfirst in this cover crop thing, and he's seeing the difference in his soil from the use of cover crops. We're digging in there, we're taking compaction tests and different things like that, and you can just see how healthy that soil has become and functioning. He's cutting back on all the synthetics and doing more of what you preach, more of a foliar applied to get that plant nutrition up. He doesn't put anhydrous, any synthetic P and K, dry fertilizer on at all. He's applying nitrogen as the plant needs it. He's putting foliars on, different things like that. And you see the soil health result from that. I mean, if you focus on your soil, if you focus on the livestock below ground, you can see such a big change. And so my biggest success has been watching how the customers react to their soil changing, and how they're noticing that, wow, this really worked. I did not believe it at first. So that's been my biggest successes.
Now, as it relates to your customers, have you seen just one type of grower that's jumping on board with cover crops or using cover crops? Or what's kind of the scope of the clientele that you deal with? How far does it vary?
That's a good question. Really, I get them all ends of the spectrum. Basically, you get the customers coming to you and say, I want to be more profitable on my cattle operation, my row crop operation. What can we do to do that? And then on the other side, you get, I've got erosion problems. I want to prevent those, or, these real small, not necessarily small problems, but they're not necessarily looking at the checks they're writing. They're looking at the problems on the operation. Hey, I want to hold my soil so that I can hand something down to my kids. You see the stats in Iowa about how much soil we lose for every bushel of corn. That's pretty alarming. So what can I do different to prevent that? So I get them on all ends, and really but they all have kind of that common occurrence. I want to do something different. Like the most dangerous words in farming is we've always done it this way. We're going to keep doing it. So they all have that in common, that they want to change for the better. And what can we do to change? And it's been interesting. They're starting to come to the seed guy for change on their farm instead of the co-op. And I think that's pretty funny.
Being a co-op guy, that Rod always makes a joke that I've been through the 10-step plan and passed, luckily. So I've got out of the system. I don't regret the time that I did, the 5 years or so, 5, 6 years that I spent in the co-op system learning. But it's interesting to see now, especially for me that I've been out of it for a while, the change in growers, really moving away from the co-op and going to more independent people, consultants. That's where we kind of fall in line and reach out to business owners like yourself and say, hey, you got to teach me some more. I don't like the way things are going. And, especially nowadays with the commodity prices in the tank right now, it's pretty dang scary, what's going to happen in 2025. So I did want to, we have a phenomenal Facebook page and a great following there. I stole a couple questions from some of the followers on Facebook. I did kind of paraphrase, but I kind of wanted to pull in some questions from them, and then I'll probably try to fill in the gaps as we go. One of our clients, Nathan, who I know personally, he kind of asked the question. It was kind of a 2 or 3 part question, so we'll see if we can get this all in. But ultimately, in regards to cover crops before corn, I think is what he was asking, maybe specifically, and we could probably talk about just cover crops in general. But in regards to cover crops before corn, what varieties or species work the best? And then what would be the best time once you got that established and the spring rolls around, you're getting ready to plant your corn, you're going to plant your corn green. How would you recommend, or what's the best way to terminate that cover crop when you're planting green? That's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah. So most of the time we'd start with, what are we doing the fall before? I'm assuming it's probably coming out of beans.
Yeah, that's a pretty safe assumption.
When are they being harvested? If we're harvesting early September, I've got a lot more options for species. If they're being harvested mid to late October, you start to run out of species. The most common is going to be cereal rye, triticale, wheat. In October, I can roll with hairy vetch and some tillage radishes. In September, I've pretty well got a lot of options in terms of clover, brassicas, your tillage radish, purple top turnip, and then all the cereal grains. So a lot of it comes down to what you're doing in the fall. When we roll into spring, your cover crop before corn, you do have to be careful. It does come down to your operation. If you are planting green, I assume most people are trying to plant in April, maybe early April. Just depends on the height of that cover crop. So If you're planting into a thick mat of cereal rye, you've got to be careful on your carbon nitrogen ratio. So you've got to kind of watch how you manage nitrogen. I've got a customer by Muscatine. They terminated their rye about 2 feet tall, planted into it while it was still kind of green a couple days later. And then they came back a few days later and put on some nitrogen, 30 pounds of nitrogen to the acre to help that cover crop break down and also give that corn a kick. So if you're planting into cereal rye, you've got to watch your carbon to nitrogen ratio because you can get a lot of nitrogen tied up in that rye mat. Roundup is your most common killer of cover crops. They pretty well handle anything. If we get into a dry year, if you sense the spring's pretty dry, get that cover crop killed early. Get that cereal rye killed early. If we're dry weather, I'd really prefer to see the cereal rye or cover crop dead 6 to 8 inches tall, just to prevent moisture being lost or prevent that tie up. So that's kind of where I would push people towards in a dry year. The things with cover crops to always remember is they are challenging to manage. You've got to really think and be prepared to react. This year up here at Oskaloosa, great family I work for, they're on plan C, or no, sorry, we're on plan Z. We're on plan Z. We've gone through the whole alphabet. So you really, it comes down to context. What's your weather? What's your location? But really, err on the side of terminating early. That's what I tell a lot of people. Keep it simple. If you start getting into a wet year, maybe you let that cover crop grow longer because it is pulling moisture out. Maybe we can get through the field faster. If we get into a dry year, get that cover crop terminated. And then the best thing to do and the easiest thing to do is take a sample of that cover crop, send it off to a lab, figure out what nutrients are in that cover crop. A cereal rye cover crop, depending on how tall it gets, it's tying up a lot of nitrogen. You can get, I think Bex did a study, they terminated at planting and then 2 weeks later, let that cover crop grow an extra 2 weeks and they tied up like 43 pounds of nitrogen. You can get a lot of yield loss on 43 pounds of nitrogen being tied up. So that before corn, I always tell people to err on the side of terminating early. You've got the cover crop. It did its job. It made it through winter. It covered that soil. You've got some residue on top, maybe terminated early to save some yield. If your nitrogen management, and if you're putting nitrogen down with the planter, you're spraying it later, if you're wide dropping it later, you can let that cover crop grow longer because you are coming in later to supplement that nitrogen that's possibly tied up. A heavy legume mix, you can be a little, you got a little bit more wiggle room on the nitrogen just because that nitrogen's there on top of the surface to help that cover crop break down. So just keep it simple. If you're worried about it, go terminate it. And that's what I tell people. 6 to 8 inches tall in a dry year. You can let it go longer in a wet year. It really comes down to those simple factors. Don't overcomplicate it. I probably overcomplicated with that response, but
well, it's a great segue into a question that I wanted to ask. When you talk about keeping it simple, and to me, cover crops are very complex, but I think to manage it properly, you do need to manage it, but you shouldn't overcomplicate it. But going back to like right now, I absolutely love putting cover crops down this time of year. You're looking at late August to mid-September timeframe. I think that's ideal. So where do you feel like drones will fit into maybe growers being more successful putting a multi-species in their fields instead of waiting for the cash crop to get harvested? I know we work with a lot of guys that have drones. I know my buddy Preston's out flying today, putting on cover crops. Where do you feel that's going, or how is that going to help, or is it going to help at all?
Yeah, so drones are I've had a lot of customers this year seed with drones. They can be very, very good. I like drones. The only thing you got to watch out for is, what species you're putting on. It's really hard to put cereal rye on with a drone because the bulk that you've got to put on per acre is so high. Drones often can't carry it. But a lot of the mixes we've done this year are going to be heavy on like brassicas, so your tillage radish, purple top turnip, kale, different things like that, clovers. So I really like drones around black layer seed and stuff, maybe just a bit ahead, or on soybeans, 10 to 15% leaf drop, seed your cover crop in there. When it comes down to aerial seeding or any type of broadcast seeding, you are counting on Mother Nature to give you a rain.
Yeah.
So if you are absolutely, relying on that cover crop, maybe drone seeding, maybe aerial seeding in general is not the best option because, coming back later, and drilling is almost going to give you a better stand in most cases. It all comes down to weather. So I'm a fan of it. It's a lot easier to justify if you've got east and west rows because of that sunlight, that sun coming over the top. You'll almost always see a better stand in those rows because, we've got to get seed down through that canopy as well as sunlight down through that canopy. And you've also got to keep in mind your residual herbicides and different things like that. If you're running a residual, broadleaves and stuff probably won't germinate, in most cases. So you've just got to it comes down to your operations, but no, they're very, very, very handy to use at certain times. They've definitely got a place. I really like them.
So kind of on that note, if you're able to go out there and say the plan A, right, the ideal time is September 15th, what is a typical mix that you are using, and how do you feel about the one-way mixes of just putting down a cereal rye?
Yeah. So one-way mixes, I don't have a problem with them if we are in like the month of October, November, because a one-way mix is about all you can do. You can add cereal rye, triticale, wheat, but that's about your only options as a mix in those months. As we get earlier, say drone seeding in late August, September timeframe, I prefer to get a diverse mix out there. I like to focus on a lot of forbs. So your broadleaves, the brassica family, things like that. Some clovers, throw those out there. Small seeded things that do well at broadcast. They really are pretty cheap because of how many seeds per pound you get. So if I'm making a mix to go in then to broadcast, aerial seed, I'm looking at probably annual ryegrass, tillage radish, purple top turnip, kale, rape. Throw it all together and then get some, Berseem clover, fixation Balanza clover. Even just some cheap medium red clover, you can throw that in as well. Winter camelina, also aerial seeds well. I mean, I get as diverse and as crazy as the customer will let me, but you gotta keep it economic as well. But most cases, just one reference, I got a guy $28 an acre for an aerial seeded mix, 27 pounds per acre. So that's pretty well easy to do. But you start getting into $50-$60 an acre, it gets a little harder.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I didn't even know how to ask this question because it's so dependent on what is in the mix. But where would you land at a typical cost per acre? And I know that's extremely difficult to answer. And so, for the listeners that are tuning into this, I just ask that you give my man Ryan some credit here because this is an unbelievably difficult question to ask. And so I'm going to preface it like this. I'm going to tell you right now, don't think whatever he shoots out there, don't think for 1 second that that's what it costs. And if you have a budget, go to Ryan and say, dude, I'll be honest with you, man. I heard you shoot out this number and I actually only have this much of a budget. Start there because that's where ultimately we land with our fertility recommendations as well. When guys are like, it's a little too steep for my blood, instead of backing out or not doing it, let's take a look at a blend, but maybe back down some of the rates a little bit so we can still have a blend out there that fits in with the budget. So I just wanted to share that real quick.
No, I completely agree. It is a lot easier for me to make a mix when you tell me kind of where your budget is at and the time frame that you're seeding as well, and kind of some of your goals. Really, the cheapest thing you can do is probably going to be cereal rye at about a bushel the acre. You're looking at $14 to $15 an acre for that, for just a bushel of cereal rye. Ben Run obviously is cheaper. I don't sell Ben Run. But then you get on the, you start getting into some of the clovers and stuff, some of the broadleaves and things. You can get up to $30 to $40 an acre. And then if I get really crazy with certain species, some of that are a little bit harder to get my hands on, I've sold a cover crop mix as about $80 an acre. Now that's not economical for everybody. But what we were testing in that mix was that $80 an acre was my entire fertility program. That mix was going, we were going to live off that for the whole year. So then you can justify it there. But really, most mixes are going to run anywhere from, we'll just say $14 to $45 an acre.
Yep.
Seed cost.
Yeah, and that, thank you for answering that. I knew it was going to be tough, but the biggest takeaway is to just have that conversation and say, hey, this is what I'm interested in, give some of the goals, and then work within those parameters to make the budget fit. So one of the things that you did mention was Clover. You're talking about some Clover. So we had a Facebook user, Troy. He asked, and I'm not quite sure what he was asking, so I'm going to ask it a couple different ways. But he asked, can clover be used with corn? And I don't know if he meant like, can clover be used as a cover crop and then terminated, and then corn, whether it's planted green or whatever, and then the corn is planted. But I was kind of feeling like he was headed down like an interseeded kind of type of question. That would be kind of my assumption, because I know a lot of people, when they relate legumes with especially a grass, a lot of guys want to interseed, alfalfa or some sort of hairy vetch or something into a corn type crop so that they can benefit from the release and uptake of nitrogen.
Yes, it can be used with corn. Typically, if we're interseeding into corn, we're going to look after V4, V5 after yield set, just so we don't have to risk anything. Green Cover Seed and Blade, Nebraska they've done a ton of tests of interseeding corn. And that's kind of the number that the industry has settled on, V4, V5. You're not seeing any yield loss. In terms of will you pick up yield from the nitrogen that clover provides, I'm not sold on it. Most of the time I see people that aren't, because it's, you're counting on that red clover to make nitrogen not only for itself, but also to share it with the corn crop. So you're asking for a lot. By the time you seed red clover, this year, red clover is high in price, about $3 a pound. By the time you aerial seed it at a higher rate, you're probably looking at 6 pounds the acre. You can start getting a little carried away on seed costs and aerial seeding it. So if you're counting on a yield bump and saving on nitrogen from that red clover in that corn crop, I'm not necessarily sold on doing that. If you're counting, you add cattle to the equation, everything gets a lot easier to pay for. So if you're counting on grazing that cover crop after corn harvest, yes, I think it's a pretty economical thing to do. But in terms of sharing nitrogen, cutting nitrogen back with that red clover, I don't necessarily think I'm sold on it. But I encourage everybody to try it. Test something. Small acres. I wouldn't risk the farm on it, but try something. See what happens.
Yeah, and to me, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but definitely kind of off air as we were chatting before we got this thing fired up. To me, it just goes back to, what's the ultimate goal with a cover crop? To me, it's more about soil health. If you can feed the microbial life in the soil longer, then you're going to get greater mineralization. You're going to get greater decomposition. That's where things like a corn on corn scenario, you're going to see the residue when you go back in the next year, the residue is going to be broken down even further, or even, maybe it's non-existent. You're going to pull a slab of soil out and throw it on a rain table, and you're going to see that water percolation and infiltration is going to be increased with cover crops. To me, it's a very slippery slope when guys are trying to use cover crops as their in-season nutritional program.
Yep. Yeah. I'm not sold on that as an in-season fertility program. I don't necessarily think that is quite possible. I know in some cases it'll work, but really it's hard to do. It's more in-season. Almost everybody I'm selling in-season stuff to is either they're really wanting to improve that soil, or they're grazing cattle, and the time frame on a late maturing crop doesn't give them the window to plant what they want in the fall. So they interseed early to get the species they want out there to improve the soil. But in terms of in-season nutrition, it's hard to seed a cover crop into a cash crop in season and get a yield response. It's very challenging.
Yep, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Now, one of the last question we had from Thomas, again, these guys were asking great questions. Some of them were kind of lengthy, and so I tried to figure out, what they were actually asking, without being able to talk to them specifically. So what I wanted to ask for Thomas was, what conditions would inhibit cover crop seeding, if there are any at all? If there's a point where you'd say, nope, we got to skip. I know they're in the plans, but we got to skip them. And then on top of that, are there any really no-nos when it comes to certain varieties or species as cover crops? Has there, been a time where guys are like, nope, we're definitely doing this. And you're like, dude, it's not going to work that way.
Yeah, so no-nos for me, it all comes down to the context of your operation. So aerial seeding is one of those things that it can work amazing and it can also be a train wreck. If we're in a drought, I don't know if we should be aerial seeding just because we're relying on that rain. Another thing, I don't like to mud cover crops in. So if we're getting rain like crazy, hold off from drilling, mudding up that field, wait a little bit. And the other thing is like timing is a big thing with cover crops and certain species because if we're into the month of October, November, we can't, there's not a lot of species we can put out there. So, don't put clovers out there in October, November. Don't put, things that won't survive and get you that value back. Tillage radishes, they say if they get 4 to 5 inches deep with their roots, they've paid for themselves. But I don't know if they will seed in November. It all comes down to context in your situation. Those are some of the big no-nos using cover crops out of season. Also using the cover crop that could get away from you, like say annual ryegrass. It can be difficult to terminate once it joints and things like that because there's not a lot of leaf surface to get that herbicide on. So that's something you've got to watch and be careful and be prepared. Know both sides of what could go right, could go wrong. Know both sides of it. Take that into account. I guess that's all I can answer for that without knowing more.
Right. So as we kind of wrap this episode up, I know it seems like we just started talking, but what are any kind of last minute tips or any tricks that you may have or just advice to the listener that tuned into this, that maybe just asking the question, is this for me or is this not for me? What is kind of that biggest piece of advice you would tell someone that's looking at getting into using cover crops?
That's a really good one. What to narrow it down to? Someone looking to get into cover crops. I would say,
or maybe it's just some advice. I mean, just advice in general. If it's somebody that's been doing cover crops, or just for the listener that's tuning into this, what advice do you have for that client, that grower?
I would say don't knock it until you try it and do the research. So when you read into how soil functions and different things like that, you've got to read into the biology and different things. So if you look at your operation and you're leaving that soil bare, whether it's after harvest, whether it's corn, beans, wheat, anything like that, if you're leaving soil bare for any prolonged period of time, that is a detriment to your soil and your operation. So think about things in the context of, kind of nature. Nature doesn't leave soil bare. She's always growing something, whether we want her to be growing that weed or not. So look at nature and see maybe there's something I can do different on my operation to emulate nature. Don't knock it till you try it and just do your research on different things because, if you go to the coffee shop, I planted rye before corn and I lost yield. Okay, well, how'd you manage it? Your cover crop didn't fail you. You failed your cover crop, so look at what you're doing, compare it to nature. Nature never, she's always growing something. She never stops. Do not leave your soil bare. I would start there. Don't leave your soil bare. Look at what you can reduce, tillage, herbicide, just kind of look at the operations, look at nature and kind of compare the two and see what she does and what you could possibly do to improve your, when you start farming sunlight, you'll realize that maybe we can do something different.
Ryan, thank you very much for all of that advice. I greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to jump on here and share some of your insight and some of your tips and tricks on cover crops and what growers can do to hopefully increase the efficiency, whether it's of their herbicide performance or ultimately nutrition that we both believe in on their farm. So thank you very much. And for you still listening, I appreciate you hanging on. I appreciate you reaching out. Appreciate you liking, sharing this podcast to anybody that you may find value in what we do. Thank you for the time today. And as always, we hope that you have a better day.